Okay, everyone, welcome back to now the second lecture of the semester and also the second lecture of Chapter 1. Today we're going to look at homeostasis and body organization. And now that we've got the first lecture out of the way, every lecture for the rest of the semester will start out with what I will call not really attendance questions. When I teach this class in person, I will always have attendance questions, which is how I will take attendance for the day. But since we're online and attendance is handled completely differently, I want you guys to still have access to these same kind of questions. Now, these are not for points, and I'll never know how well you did on them, but they are intended to be a way to look back at material that we have covered previously just to see, are you understanding, are you keeping up with material, or do you need to go back and study again some of that older stuff? So let's look at today's not really attendance questions. What is the difference between anatomy and physiology? At what level of structural organization does life appear? And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts is a way to summarize the idea of what school of thought. So what I would like to ask you guys to do is pause the video and try to answer these before I give the answers away. That way you can kind of see, am I up to speed? Am I retaining this information, or should I go back and study a little bit? So let's see what the answers to these are. What is the difference between anatomy and physiology? Well, anatomy is the study of structure or form. It's looking at how things are shaped, what they're made of. And physiology is the study of function. How does something work? At what level of structural organization does life appear? Here we're going to say the answer is the cellular level. Remember, there are things smaller than the cell, but they do not exhibit all of the characteristics of life. The cell is where that first appears. And that kind of ties into the next question. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts is a way to summarize the idea of what school of thought. That is the idea of holism. Holism. Remember, holism said basically we can look at individual parts and how they work together, but when we look at something big, for example, the cell, at certain levels of organization, new features appear that were not simply the result of putting smaller pieces together. So we had things like atoms making molecules and molecules making organelles, and then we can put the organelles together, but something special happens when we get to at the cellular level. Life appears, and that's more than just a bunch of organelles packed into a cell. That's something unique that appears at the cellular level. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with today's lecture. Okay, so now let's dive into something that's going to be sticking with us all semester long and in Bio 139, and that is the topic of homeostasis. Now, different books will give different definitions to homeostasis, and they're all pretty confusing, so let's see some of those definitions. First, homeostasis is the maintenance of relatively stable internal conditions despite continuous changes in the environment. And I know that that sounds like a bunch of words just kind of thrown together, and it probably doesn't make much sense. So some books streamline it a little bit, and they just say homeostasis is a dynamic state of equilibrium. And while that's a shorter statement, it still doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. So let's think of what homeostasis really means. Let's think about body temperature. Well, if I ask you what normal body temperature is, well, for the average healthy young adult male, body temperature is normally about 98.6 or about 37 degrees Celsius. Now, there's lots of times that maybe it's a little bit higher, maybe it's a little bit lower. So it's constantly fluctuating. There's always going to be some changes, but it's going to remain relatively constant. It's going to be typically 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 Celsius. So even though it's constantly changing, it's dynamic, it's going to pretty much remain the same. It's going to be at equilibrium. Or, looking up here at this definition, maintenance of a relatively stable internal condition. So temperature is relatively stable at 98.6, despite continuous changes in the environment. So as your body temperature rises and falls, or even if you were to go outside on a hot day, the environment can warm your body up, or in the winter, it can cool your body down. Your body temperature remains relatively constant at about 98.6. So homeostasis is how our body maintains a relatively stable condition for all sorts of things, not just body temperature. Things like glucose levels, calcium levels, body temperature, all the things that are about, have a set point. Maybe blood pressure, maybe heart rate. So all of these things have normal ranges, but they remain relatively constant. And this stability, this level, is maintained by contributions of all of your organ systems. It's not going to be one thing contributing. So when we talk about body temperature, there's a lot of different things that go into maintaining that normal body temperature. And we'll see some of them here in just a moment, although I'm sure you already know what a lot of them are. But when we're talking about homeostasis, you're going to see a variation of this picture quite a bit over the next 2 semesters. This is called a homeostatic control system or a homeostatic feedback loop. And it's going to have different pictures tied into it, but it's always going to have something that looks kind of like a teeter-totter with different body parts laid across it. So this is just a generic homeostatic feedback loop or homeostatic control system. And they're all going to have the same parts. It's just there's going to be different body structures that fit in these parts. So let's see what the parts are first. The stimulus. The stimulus is what causes something to change. And we'll give some examples of this in just a little bit. So don't worry if that doesn't make sense to you, because in just a moment, we're going to apply some examples to each of these. The stimulus is what causes a change in the variable. And the variable is what's being measured. Body temperature, or heart rate, or calcium level, something like that. The receptor is the part of our body that detects the change. Input is, once the receptor picks that change up, it's going to send that information, that input, along towards something called the control center. The control center is almost always going to be either the brain or the spine. Not every time, but almost always the control center is going to be the brain or the spine. So the stimulus is what detects the change. What causes the change. The receptor is what detects the change. It sends the input to the control center. Now, this is all going towards the brain or spine or whatever the control center happens to be, and we call that the afferent pathway. So input signals travel along the afferent pathway. Now, the control center decides what to do about that change. And it's going to send signals to some part of your body that's going to actually respond to that change. And this is called the effector. The effector is what actually responds to the change. Now, that information going from the control center to the effector travels along what we call the efferent pathway. So now let's back up. Afferent and efferent, those words sound really, really similar, especially if you just say something quickly like afferent. Well, did I say afferent or did I say efferent? What I like to do is be really, really stressed on that first letter. I will say afferent or efferent. And that's not really the way that they're pronounced. Normally it is afferent or efferent. But those don't really sound too much different, so I overdo it. Afferent and efferent. So how do we keep them straight since they're so similar? A, information is arriving at the control center. E, information is exiting the control center. So now we get to the effector. The effector does something in response to that, original change. So the effector causes the response. Now don't stress it if you don't understand exactly what this means because we haven't given an example yet. But just keep this in mind that all homeostatic feedback loops have these parts. And we'll come back to it in just a moment with an example. Now, when we're talking about feedback loops, there's going to be two types. There's negative feedback and positive feedback. And normally when people see the word negative, they think that it means bad and positive is good, and that's not what it means in this chapter, and it's really not what it means in physiology in general. What a negative feedback loop is, and that's really what most of the feedback loops in our body are, it's going to be talking about how does our body respond to this change. So in a negative feedback loop, the response reduces or shuts off the original stimulus. It's going to be the variable changing in the opposite direction of the initial stimulus or the initial change. So, for example, we keep talking about body temperature. When you get cold, what do? You shiver, and that's going to do what? It's going to warm you up. That's a negative feedback. When you start out cold, your body heats you up. Or when you're really hot, what do? You sweat. And what happens? It cools you down. So when you're hot, the response is cool you off. Whatever the initial change is, the response is in the opposite direction. That's a negative feedback loop. So examples include regulation of body temperature that we just talked about, and that's going to use the nervous system. We'll see how that is in just a moment. Regulation of blood glucose by insulin. So remember a moment ago, I said that the control center is almost always the brain or spine? Well, almost always, because in this case, this is going to use the endocrine system, which is not the brain and spine. So let's look at our example. This is a negative feedback loop, and we're using body temperature as the example. Now the stimulus is going to be heat. Let's look at the top part. This is when your body gets too hot. So the stimulus is heat, and that's going to change the variable. It's going to change body temperature by warming you up. Your body temperature rises. And how does your body know that your body temperature rises? Well, we've got receptors in a few places in the body. For example, in our skin. We've also got something in our brain that detects it, but let's just look at the skin. So your skin detects, or some of the nerve endings in your skin detect that your temperature is rising. So those receptors are going to send that information along the afferent pathway towards the control center, which is a part of your brain. Your brain is going to decide what to do. It's going to say, it's getting really warm. We need to cool the body off. So it's going to do something about it. It's going to send information along the efferent pathway towards the effectors. In this case, the effectors are your sweat glands. That says sweet glands. That's not a real thing. So sweat glands, and what's going to happen? You're going to sweat. And when you sweat, your body temperature is going to drop. So the effectors are the sweat glands. The response is sweating, and that sweat will evaporate, cooling you off. That cuts off the original stimulus. But What happens if you get too cold? So there's another side to this feedback loop. When you get too cold, then the receptors are going to detect that and send information along the afferent pathway to the brain. The brain is going to detect that and say, oh, okay, now we're too cold. We need to warm up. So it's going to send information along the efferent pathway to the effectors, which in this case are going to be your muscles. Now it says skeletal muscles, and we'll talk about the different types of muscles later in the semester. But skeletal muscles are the ones that you can think about moving and move them. Most of the muscles that we have in our body are skeletal muscles. So our skeletal muscles are going to respond by contracting and relaxing really, really quickly. We're going to shiver. And as we shiver, that produces heat. So our body temperature rises back to normal. Sometimes our body temperature is too hot. Sometimes our body temperature is too cold. So it's dynamic. But we keep it relatively stable at about 98.6. So that's that equilibrium, a dynamic state of equilibrium. That's homeostasis. And this, again, was a negative feedback loop. But some of the feedback loops in our body are positive. Not very many, and they are things that don't happen often. So let's see. Positive feedback loops, the response enhances or exaggerates the original stimulus. These are things that are infrequent. They don't require continuous adjustment the way, for example, body temperature does. And two examples are, and these aren't the only two, but these are two examples, labor contractions and blood clotting. So let's talk about labor contractions real quick. When a woman goes into labor, the baby's head pushes against the cervix. And as the cervix stretches, because the baby's head is pressing against it, it sends signals to the brain. The brain releases something called oxytocin. One of the things that oxytocin does is it causes the uterus to contract, which is going to push the baby. And as the baby is pushed, its head presses against the cervix even more, which causes more oxytocin to be released, which causes more uterine contraction, pressing the baby's head against the cervix harder. More oxytocin, more contractions, more oxytocin, more contractions. So we can see that's what's different about positive feedback and negative feedback. In positive feedback, the response enhances the original stimulus. Baby's head pushing causes more oxytocin, which causes the baby's head to push even harder. And that continues until delivery is complete. Blood clotting, same thing. As you, for example, get a cut and you start to bleed and your blood starts to clot, it causes more platelets to come, which causes the clotting to enhance, which causes more platelets to come, which causes the clotting to enhance, which causes more platelets to come, and it just keeps building and building until the clot is complete. So you don't need to know the details of how labor contractions work or how blood clotting works, because those will actually be discussed next semester in Bio 139. But what you should know here is the difference in positive feedback versus negative feedback. Next, we're going to change topics and talk a little bit about gradients. So gradients is when we have a difference in something like concentration or pressure. And so let's just look at what a gradient is. Really, when it comes down to it, a gradient just means there's more of something in one area and less of something in another area. For example, kind of a big picture idea of a gradient is, let's say you walk into a gym and there's like 30 people all gathered together in one corner of the gym, but there's only a few people scattered everywhere else. Well, now there's a gradient because there's a large group of people here and not so many people over in the other area. And why are gradients important? Because it's going to dictate how a lot of stuff happens, not just in the body, but outside the body as well. Everything likes to move from high to low, or we can say something will want to move down its gradient. And why is that? Well, there's lots of different reasons, and we'll discuss them throughout the semester, but it all comes down to there's no energy used. Let's look at this picture here. This boy is riding a wagon down a hill. He's going down the gradient, and that doesn't use any energy. But if he wants to pull that wagon back up the hill, that does use energy. And things like to go from high concentration or high pressure or high whatever, from high to low, because no energy is used. But there are times, and we will see some examples in the body this semester, where things need to move from low to high or up their gradient. And that requires energy, like the boy pulling the wagon up the hill. So when we talk about gradients in the body, we're going to talk about pressure gradients. We're going to talk about concentration gradients, electrical gradients, thermal gradients. So what are these? Well, pressure gradients, this is what happens when there's a greater pressure in one area and a lower pressure in the other area. That's what causes blood to flow through your blood vessels. When your heart contracts, it creates high pressure. And further through your blood vessels, there's low pressure, so blood is moving from high to low pressure. When we breathe, air is moving in and out of our lungs from high pressure to low pressure. Concentration gradients. If there is a greater concentration of something in one area versus another. For example, when we eat food, there's a greater concentration of certain nutrients in our intestines than there is on the other side. So those nutrients will move from high concentration inside the intestines to low concentration on the other side where our blood is. Electrical gradients. This is how our muscles and our nerves work. We're going to have ions, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, but these are just charged particles in our body. Ions move in and out of the cells down their electrical gradient. If we have positive charges on one side, negative charges on the other side, they want to move towards each other. Thermal gradients. This is a difference in heat. When one area is warm and one area is cooler, then things will move. The warmer particles will move towards the cooler area. So here's that boy riding down the hill, down the gradient, pulling it back up the gradient uses energy. When the heart contracts, it creates high pressure. If there's lower pressure over here, the blood will be pushed down its pressure gradient. Glucose moving into cells moves down its concentration gradient. Sodium ions that have a positive charge move into a cell down its electrical gradient because the inside of cells have a slightly negative charge. So the positive moves towards the negative. And heat. Our blood carries heat with it to all parts of the body. And that heat will transfer out of the blood into the other parts of the body when we're cold. When we're warm, then that heat will move out of the blood to the skin, and then as we sweat and that sweat is evaporated, it carries that heat away. So these are some examples of some gradients in the body. There's a section in your book on the language of medicine, and this is not something that I'm going to cover in lecture, but it goes back to something I pointed out in the last lecture, and that is root words. You're going to see a lot about root words in this part of the chapter, and they will really, really prep you for things the rest of your career. Because if you're going into something medical, you're going to hear these same root words over and over and over as part of the language of your program. So it's a really good idea to read through this and get a feel for a lot of these root words. Now, in your book, that's the end of chapter 1, and we go into Atlas A, and I just smush them together because really they all go together. So now we're in Atlas A, and we're going to talk about something called anatomical position. And we see a picture here of a man and a woman standing in anatomical position. This is something that is a way of referring to the human body. We're going to see a lot of patients throughout your career, and the patient sometimes will be standing upright. Sometimes they will be laying on a table. Sometimes if they're kids, they may be squatting on the floor, moving around, doing all sorts of stuff. Every patient that you look at is going to be in a different position. But when we're talking about something, we're going to refer to them as though they are in anatomical position. So let's say you've got a kid who's in the middle of doing a somersault or showing you that he can do a headstand or something like that. He's upside down. If you wanted to talk about the position of his head to his chest, you might be tempted to say his chest is above his head because he's standing upside down. But no, you don't. The head is always above the chest, always, because we always refer to the body as if it is in anatomical position. And in anatomical position, the head is above the chest. So what is anatomical position? We're standing upright with the feet slightly apart, arms at the sides with palms facing forward, eyes looking forward. That is anatomical position. And we can see that we are now facing these two patients. And one of the absolute hardest thing for new students to get used to doing is when we are talking about the patients and using directional terms, not only do we refer to them in anatomical position, we have to make sure we're talking about right and left in reference to the patient, not yourself. This, if you can see my arrow here, this is on your left, but this is not the patient's left arm, this is the patient's right arm. So, be sure to flip left and right when you're talking about someone as if they are in anatomical position. What is this? This is the patient's right knee. What is this? This is the patient's left elbow. Always refer to left and right of the patient, not yourself. When we talk about planes, planes are imaginary divisions that we will cut the body into. And sometimes we need to talk about planes. For example, when we're talking about x-rays or CAT scans, or if we're looking at a specimen of a slice of an arm or something. Well, there's different ways that we can slice the patient. For example, this line right here, this kind of bluish line, is called a sagittal plane. Sagittal planes are imaginary planes that divide the patient into left and right. Sagittal planes divide into left and right. Now there is something also called a mid-sagittal plane, or sometimes it's also called a median plane. And that's really what we see here. Mid-sagittal or median planes, they don't just divide into left and right, they divide into equal left and right portions. So we can see this plane is going straight through this imaginary midline of her body. So that is not just a sagittal plane, but it's a mid-sagittal or median plane. Next, let's look at this purple one. This is called a frontal plane, or sometimes it's also called a coronal plane. Frontal planes divide a patient into front and back, or anterior and posterior. So, why is it called a coronal plane? Well, later in the semester, when we get to the skeletal system, we're going to see something up here at the top of the skull called the coronal suture. Corona means crown. So it cuts through the crown of the head. Coronal suture, coronal plane, and frontal plane. So frontal plane and coronal plane are the same thing. They divide into front and back. And the last one, this orange one right here, is called a transverse plane. Transverse or horizontal. And transverse planes divide the patient into top and bottom, into superior and inferior portions. Now there is one more that's not shown in this picture, and it's not quite as common, but it's called an oblique plane. And oblique just means diagonal. So it could be going like this, diagonally. So that's an oblique plane. Here's some examples using other visuals. So a sagittal section. Here we're looking into the interior of someone. There's been a plane that has removed their left side and we're looking into their right side. Here's a frontal section of the patient's heart and lungs. We've removed the front of them and we're looking into the back of them. Here's a transverse. We're looking down onto a patient's head that has had the top removed. Now, the next quite a bit of your outline is self-study, so we will not talk about them in lecture, but you are expected to know these. So here's directional terminology. Directional terminology is, in medicine, we don't talk about front and back, top and bottom. Now, I've been using them so far because that's what we're used to hearing. But when we're talking medicine, we will say superior and inferior. The head is superior to the chest, or the chest is inferior to the head. We'll say anterior, posterior. That's front and back. Next, and this will really go hand in hand with Lab 1, all of the different regions of the body's surface. So, for example, right here we can see cervical, pointing to the neck. So if we talked about this region right here, we would not say her neck. We would say her cervical region. Right here, we might be tempted to say the tip of the shoulder, the point of the shoulder, but this is the acromial region. It doesn't show it here, but one of the more common ones, forehead, we would say frontal region. So in that section of your outline where I have all the different surface terminology words, what I would like you to do is put in the more common layman's terms. So where I have frontal, you would write forehead. Where I have acromial, you would write shoulder. Then we have body quadrants or abdominopelvic quadrants, and body regions or abdominopelvic regions. These are ways that we can narrow down these areas here. And let's say someone comes in with a pain right here. Well, we could talk about the pain in the patient's right hypochondriac region. Did you catch that? This is right. Even though it's on your left, it's the patient's right hypochondriac region. So that can help narrow down to, well, what's in the right hypochondriac region, or what's in the umbilical region, or what's in the left iliac region. It helps us narrow it down because there's a lot going on in this part of the body, so we can kind of divide it up into smaller sections. Now let's talk about body cavities, because the body has quite a bit of internal space, and those internal spaces are divided into different cavities. And we've got two main internal body cavities. We've got the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity, and they are closed to the environment. That means they are completely sealed off. There's no exposure to the outside. And inside the ventral body cavity, which we'll see in just a moment, that's where we find most of our organs, what some people will just call your guts. Well, the real word for that are viscera. Viscera are the organs in your ventral body cavity. So what do I mean, dorsal and ventral? This yellow area here is the dorsal body cavity. All of this red here is the ventral body cavity. Now, both the dorsal and ventral body cavity have smaller cavities that make them up. So let's just look at the yellow first, the dorsal body cavity. Up at the top, inside the skull, there's something called the brain case, which is more properly called the cranial cavity. And then running down through the vertebrae in your back, we've got the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity is where we find the brain. The vertebral cavity is where we find the spinal cord. Now, if we look at all those red areas right here, this is the ventral body cavity. There's a lot more organs in the ventral body cavity than in the dorsal. So, the ventral body cavity, the organs there have some membranes surrounding them called serous membranes. Sometimes they're just called serosa. The serous membrane is a very, very thin, double-layered membrane. And all of your organs in your ventral body cavity are surrounded by these serous membranes. Now, even though it is called a double-layered membrane, it's really one layer that folds back on itself to make a second layer. It's continuous. One layer lies directly against the organ that it's covering, and that's called the visceral serosa. Remember, viscera, organ? So the layer of this membrane, since it's double layered, the layer that rests on the surface of the organ is called the visceral serosa, or the visceral layer. And then the outer layer is the parietal serosa. Parietal means off to the side. So the parietal layer, or the parietal serosa, lines the internal body cavity. Now, every organ in your ventral body cavity will be surrounded by these double layer membranes. And in every case, the visceral serosa, the visceral layer lies on the organ, and the parietal serosa is off to the side, lining that body cavity. What do I mean by that? Here's the body cavity. We're going to have one layer around the inside of this cavity, the other layer surrounding the organ itself. So there's a little bit of a space between these two layers. And this space is filled with a liquid called serous fluid. And the serous fluid, where does it come from? Both of these layers are going to secrete that fluid into this space. And this space acts as a lubricant, so that these two layers, this fluid in the space acts as a lubricant, so these two layers don't rub up against each other and irritate. So we'll come back to that idea in just a moment. Again, here is the red is the ventral body cavity, and we can see there's a lot going on here. From the front, here we go again. There's a lot going on here. The ventral body cavity is going to be broken into two subdivisions. We're going to kind of get like those Russian nesting dolls where we have one inside of another, inside of another. So we have the ventral body cavity, but it's going to be broken into two regions separated by the diaphragm. Up at the top, we have the thoracic cavity. Down at the bottom, we have the abdominopelvic cavity. Thoracic, abdominopelvic, separated by the diaphragm. Now, the thoracic and the abdominopelvic both are part of the ventral, but also the thoracic and the abdominopelvic are going to be broken down even further. So let's look at the thoracic body cavity. The thoracic body cavity has 3 cavities inside of it. It has the pleural cavity, both a left and a right pleural cavity. The pleural cavities are where we find a lung. So the right lung is in the right pleural cavity. The left lung is in the left pleural cavity. I'm going to back up here. Here's one pleural cavity and the other pleural cavity. Now, in between them, we have something called the mediastinum. And the mediastinum is broken down even further into the superior mediastinum and the pericardium, or the pericardial cavity. So the thoracic cavity contains left and right pleural cavities and also the mediastinum. And the mediastinum contains the superior mediastinum and the pericardial cavity. Now, the pericardial cavity is where we find the heart. So if I were just to ask you, let's go back to our picture again. Where is the heart? The heart sits within the pericardial cavity, which sits within the mediastinal cavity, which sits within the thoracic cavity, which is a part of the ventral body cavity. One inside the other, inside the other. Now, let's go back and look at the pleural cavities where the lungs are. So these purple areas right here. The pleural cavities contain the lungs, right and left pleural, right and left lung. And remember, these organs are surrounded by those serous membranes. So the lungs have a 2-layer membrane surrounding each one of them. Now, we can give more specific names since we're talking about more specific organs. We were just saying serous membranes, but now since we're talking about the lungs, we can give those serous membranes more descriptive, more specific names. We call them the pleura. The pleura are the serous membranes that cover the lungs. The layer that rests directly on the surface of the lung is the visceral pleura. The outer layer that lines the pleural cavity is the parietal pleura. And that liquid in between them is called pleural fluid. That is that serous fluid that we talked about earlier. It's just around the lungs. We give it a more specific name. We call it pleural fluid. When we look at the mediastinum, we can say within the mediastinum we find the pericardial cavity, and the pericardial cavity contains the heart. So that membrane that surrounds the heart is called the pericardium. Now, the layer that rests directly on the surface of the heart is called the parietal pericardium. I said that wrong. I apologize. The layer that rests directly on the surface of the heart is the visceral pericardium. Viscera, remember, on the surface of. So the visceral pericardium surrounds the heart, but surrounding the pericardial cavity is the parietal pericardium. In between these 2 layers, acting as a lubricant, is pericardial fluid. Now, if we look down here at the red and green areas, this is the abdominopelvic cavity. Now, unlike the thoracic cavity where everything was divided very, very neatly. Down here, there's really not any separation between the two parts. The abdominopelvic cavity has the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, but there is no division between them. Up here, we had those membranes surrounding here and here and here. But down here, there is no real separation. The only separation is down towards the bottom. It comes to kind of a funnel-shaped area around the genitals and the urinary bladder. But there's no actual physical separation between the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So one big two-layer membrane surrounds all of the organs in the abdominopelvic cavity. And that membrane is called the peritoneum. The peritoneum surrounds things like your liver, your spleen, your stomach, your large and small intestines, your urinary bladder, and your genitals. So the outer layer that surrounds the entire abdominopelvic cavity is called the parietal peritoneum. The layer that rests directly on the surface of all of those organs is called the visceral peritoneum. And the fluid in between those layers is called peritoneal fluid. So in all three of these slides, when we were talking about the pleural cavities and those membranes, when we were talking about the pericardial cavity and those membranes, and we were talking about the abdominopelvic cavity and those membranes, they are all serous membranes with two layers filled with serous fluid. All we have done is just given them more descriptive names, more specific names, based on where they were found and what they were covering. And here is an example. This is a part of the peritoneum around a portion of the intestines. We can see that it is a very, very thin membrane, and this is actually part of the parietal layer. The visceral layer we can't see without cutting this. Now, sometimes that serous fluid is not at the level that it needs to be. Sometimes we don't have enough, sometimes we don't have any at all. And remember, it was a lubricant. It kept those two layers from rubbing against each other. So when we don't have enough of that fluid, then the visceral and parietal layers rub against each other and irritate each other, and it can cause some pretty severe pain. When we don't have enough pleural fluid, then we get something called pleurisy, and that's what we see here. Pleurisy, every time we take a breath, those two layers rub against each other, irritate each other, and it causes a crushing sensation that is often mistaken for a heart attack. A lot of people show up for the ER thinking they're having a heart attack, when in reality they're having pleurisy. If that happens around the heart, it's called pericarditis, when those two layers interfere with each other, when they rub against each other and cause inflammation because there's not enough of that pericardial fluid. And down in the abdominopelvic area, it's peritonitis. That's when there's not enough fluid in between the visceral and parietal peritoneum. They rub against each other, and it can cause anything from very severe stomach aches to also feeling rather like a heart attack. But all of these things, the thing that they all have in common is not enough or insufficient serous fluid. Now, okay, so unless you have had me before and are repeating the class, this is your first run-in with this. In your outline throughout the semester, in Bio 139 and 137 both, we're going to see 4 or 5 asterisks in a row with nothing written on them when we look at the outline. And what that's going to signal is in lecture, we're going to have something called a thinking cap question. And thinking cap questions are a way to apply a little bit of critical thinking based on something that we've recently discussed. And in person, I would stop and we would kind of discuss this. And since we're online, we don't really have that opportunity. So what I would ask you to do is pause the video, try to work your way through this using critical thinking, and then listen to the answer. Now, thinking cap questions make excellent bonus questions on exams. They're not always, but they make really good bonus questions for exams. So let's look at this thinking cap question. Why is the abdominal cavity at greater risk for injury than the thoracic cavity? And as a hint, feel your chest and then feel your gut. So remember, the abdominal cavity is down where things like your stomach and your liver and your intestines are. And the thoracic cavity is where things like your lungs and your heart are. So why is the abdominal cavity at greater risk for injury than the thoracic cavity? So pause the video and try to think about that. And then let's see what the answer is. Well, the abdominal cavity isn't surrounded by bones, whereas the thoracic cavity has a rib cage and a vertebral column surrounding it. So things like your heart and your lungs have a lot more protection. Things like your stomach and your intestines, they don't have as much protection. All they've got surrounding them is skin and muscle and fat. Now we have some other body cavities than the ones that we've mentioned, and a lot of these are exposed to the environment. For example, your oral cavity, which is inside your mouth, your digestive cavity, which is everything from your esophagus all the way down to the anus. All of that is the digestive cavity. The nasal cavity inside your nose where your sinuses are found. Orbital cavities, which is where your eyeballs sit. And middle ear cavities, which is where your eardrum and inner ear are. Or, well, middle ear, I mean. So they are all exposed to the environment. And then we have one group of cavities all through the body that are not exposed to the environment called synovial cavities. And those are cavities that surround a lot of your joints. Now here's something that's not really a thinking cap question, but you can kind of use it as one. And this is something that typically kind of surprises a lot of my students, and I make a big show out of moving my body around in class when we're in person. I lean my head back and open my mouth and spread my arms out, and I ask, is the interior of the digestive cavity, such as the inside of your stomach, is that internal or external to the body? So think about the very, very inside of your stomach where your food is. Is that inside or outside the body? Shockingly, the inside of your stomach is outside of your body. If you lean your head back and open your mouth wide, there is no separation. Well, there's a little bit of mucus and muscle, but there is no real separation between the outside environment all the way through your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestines, your large intestines, all the way down to your anus. There is a tube that runs through that is open on both ends. So the entire inside of your digestive tract is really outside your body. And the same thing goes for the inside of your lungs. When you take a deep breath, air is moving into your lungs, but that's still outside of your body. All right, so that's where we will end chapter 1. As far as the lecture, there's still a little bit of stuff on your outline for you to fill out for part of self-study. Now, there will be several lectures posted for chapter 2. It's a little bit more detailed, it's a little bit longer than chapter 1, so there will be quite a few lectures posted for chapter 2. In the meantime, if you have any questions at all, please ask me. Don't move on thinking, okay, I'll catch up later. No, always ask the questions as you have them. All right, take care, and I will talk to you soon.